Hey guys, welcome back to another Fundamentals Friday. So for this Fundamental Friday, we will be discussing one of the more important things that will turn your scenes into something that's hopefully a bit more eye-catching, and that is composition. Composition is something that is very broad. It encompasses a lot of theory, but I'm going to try to simplify it into just 3 points that would help you to create a little bit of a checklist to get your compositions, give them that little bit of a boost very easily. So hopefully that all makes sense. Let me know if you have more suggestions for future Fundamental Fridays. But for now, let's dive into the lesson. So the first couple of rules that we are actually going to be discussing is going to be these 3 rules that I think basically encompass the core of what creates appealing compositions. The first thing is going to be depth. Depth is the most important thing to add to the scene because, we want to see how far away things are. We want to see how close by things are. We need to convey that information to our viewer. Flow is also obviously very important because that's what makes a scene feel more dynamic and interesting and engaging, and should provide us with a good way to kind of lead the eye through the scene so that people can actually follow along. The focus, obviously, that's where we can actually pinpoint what the most important part is about our composition. And I think that's something that a lot of people struggle with, kind of creating a clear hierarchy into this is what the viewer should see first, this is what the viewer should see second, and this is what the viewer should not see, really. So these are the 3 main principles, in my opinion, that we should try to focus on. So first of all, let's actually dive into depth and what depth brings to the table. So with something like depth, we have a couple of different things that we can actually discuss, and I've broken it down into perspective, repetition, overlap, and atmosphere. Now, these terms alone can already provide us with a fairly clear insight as to what brings what to the table, but let's actually, provide some examples to see exactly what we mean. Perspective is probably the easiest one to understand, because with perspective, it's mainly just the idea from the moment we put down something like a horizon line, we don't have actually enough information to understand how far away things are, because a horizon line is just a line. That's not really telling me anything as to what I'm supposed to be looking at or how far away things actually are in relationship to each other. I could place different shapes in there at random, and it might still feel like they're just kind of floating in space, and that is not something that really helps with adding depth. So what do? We want to use our perspective to our advantage, and therefore we need to think about the different lines that perspective tend to offer. Now, obviously, for those who have already studied a little bit of perspective in their time, a perspective grid tends to have vanishing points, and those vanishing points are basically just a single point on the horizon line where our lines are converging for our perspective grid. And these lines alone already provide us with a fairly clear scene that does help me actually give a pretty good idea as to how far away things are. Because now suddenly, from the moment I put something that's this wide over here and I put that same thing over there, because it's become smaller, now I have a relationship of the size that gives me enough information as to how far away it actually is. Not only that, imagine I put now something in here like, let's say, a road. Well, obviously that road itself is following the perspective lines, and that does give me a pretty decent start to at least hint at some kind of depth into the scene. The second type of lines that we can use is not the converging lines towards the vanishing point, but it's actually the idea that the closer we get to our horizon line, the more closely we can pack things together. So the moment I'm actually creating my scene, we actually want to keep in mind that the spacing between these separate elements that we put in here is very, very important. So if I would be putting in stuff like trees, for example, and those trees themselves, like over here, they might be a little bit further spread apart height-wise still. They still feel like they're kind of pretty close together, even though they are definitely on a different elevation in this particular drawing. Now, the closer we get towards the top of the composition, in this case, towards that horizon line, the closer those trees are going to be bunched together, and back here, they're going to be just very narrow, and we can almost simplify them into just a single shape. The same thing applies to something like a river or a road that's actually winding. These lines kind of indicate how fast I need to turn my road around to actually follow the proper sense of depth. And we can see that the turns start becoming wider and wider the further, once again, we get away from that horizon line. A very easy way to once again hint at depth without actually having done much. So every scene, no matter whether it's organic or like a cityscape, needs to have at least that foundation of perspective that should be visible. Something recognizable should be in there, something that we can actually relate to that perspective grid that we have laid out. Now, aside from perspective, there's a couple other things that we can discuss. Stuff like repetition, for example, is very important. And what do I mean by repetition? Well, that is when we have an element in our composition that is being repeated in our scene. So to further explain that idea, it's mainly the idea we might know the size of a tree. So by putting a tree in the foreground over here, and putting that same tree in the background over there, because I know how large this tree is, suddenly I also know how large things are supposed to be that far away. That's why quite often, for example, in concept art, we have just, our little stick salesman standing there, because that's a dude for scale. From the moment I put another dude over there, I suddenly have an idea of how far away he is because he's shrunken down that much, once again, due to the perspective. So something that you'll notice in this class is all of these points are going to very heavily be intertwined. They're going to relate very heavily to each other because it's all part of the same thing that we call drawing, like perspective and creating these overlaps and this repetition to add depth into a scene. It's all part of drawing, because drawing, and I think I've mentioned this in a previous Fundamentals Friday, is just the arrangement of elements on our canvas. So back to repetition. The repetition can be fairly visible in this example. Like, this is the original scene, and in that scene we can immediately see we have these three big mushroom towers, like giant structures really. And these three structures provide us with a very, very clear idea all of a sudden as to how far away things are supposed to be, because I have my first one over there, my second one over here, and my third one over there, but they shrink so heavily in size that there's really no question that this one is further back than this one. So it's the repetition of stuff that we have in our scene on different levels of depth that will really help emphasizing that composition. Aside from that repetition, we have a couple other things that we can actually take into account, like, for example, overlap. And overlap, I think, is most easy to explain when we actually show a good example and a bad example. Something that I see quite often in student work is they'll create a scene and it's like an epic mountainscape. And for example, I have my mountain range in the back, and then I have my cloud sort of off to the side, and then there's some kind of structure, whether it's a house or a castle, or at least some kind of focal point off over here. And then we have a forest over there. Maybe we have another tree over there. Maybe there's a lake over there. And you can see that this is actually not a good composition. And I've obviously exaggerated how much we can actually miss the ball when it comes to, well, this idea of creating overlap in a scene. Because if I take these same elements and I just start rearranging them, like what if I now suddenly decide, well, I'm going to split this mountain range up into two different mountains, with one mountain being in front of the other, for example. Like, suddenly that is already a starting point to add depth to the scene. I can switch that up as well by adding my cloud actually behind these two, and maybe even in between here, creating like a little fog cloud that's actually in between these two mountains as well. Because that's, once again, two extra levels of overlap that I've just added to my scene that would really help create these more interesting and dynamic looking compositions. So something like that. Now suddenly, within even only the background, we've created 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 levels of depth because of all of these overlapping structures. And we can really milk this quite heavily. We can emphasize that overlap quite a lot. So for example, another interesting thing that we can then do is, what if I design this castle that we have to the side now in a way where it's actually this large that it is overlapping with my mountains in the background. And suddenly, because I've done this, once again, I've added 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 levels of depth into my composition. And we can work our way towards the foreground, think, okay, what if I now add in like a tree, for example, that's in front. So we'll add in like a tree right over there that's actually sat in front of the building, but also perhaps add in like another few bushes and trees behind it, so that I'm creating basically more overlapping elements to this composition. And perhaps, you know, not everything has to overlap. I will add in one that's just isolated to the side, that's just there sat on its own. Even stuff like the lake, I can think about trying to have that overlap, so creating a shape for that lake so that it's actually going behind the castle, for example. Also, once again, does really help with creating that extra depth into the scene. And especially if I then go even further forward and I'll do something like, for example, I'll have more forest off in the foreground. And once again, the composition has really maximized the amount of depth that we can actually add. So right now, going from something that has 1, 2 levels of depth, we went to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 levels of depth because of the way I've arranged these elements that I'm now placing into my scene. So it's a very, very powerful tool to very quickly start adding depth. So one thing that we want to avoid, just to kind of summarize everything, is that we can isolate all of our elements in their own little bounds, because that's a very bad choice for a composition. All right, so that covers overlap. Aside from overlap, we still have stuff like atmosphere. And atmosphere, once again, is a very cool element to play around with, but that's mostly visible in painting, obviously, because when we're working with atmosphere, and that's actually the main way that we can start including depth through adding that atmosphere. Because what atmosphere actually is, it is, in painting at least, the idea that the further back I go into the environment, the less contrast I'm going to have between my values. And also the more of the color of the environment is actually going to seep into, in this case, particularly my shadow side of my building. So we can see that in the foreground, I have a very dark color for the shadows of the grass. The further back I go, the brighter that shadow becomes. I have blue in the shadow of my castle right over there, which once again shows that it's further away. And the blue on the castles further back is brighter because it's once again further away and we have more of that cloud atmosphere in between there. And that really creates these zones of depth into our scene that once again really help emphasizing how far away things actually are. Now, there are obviously ways to kind of show off depth and atmosphere just with lines, and the main way is obviously we can still use our line weight to our advantage. So the idea of, for example, the fact that I can play around with having more contrast between my thickest and my thinnest lines near foreground. So my thinnest lines will be quite thin and my thickest lines might have to be quite thick. And then when I go further into the background, I can kind of soften and start kind of decreasing the amount of contrast I have between my thickest and my thinnest lines, while when I'm all the way back, perhaps my lines will be very, very thin and my contrast between the thickness of those lines has become even less. Because again, what atmospheric perspective actually does, it decreases contrast for further things are back. So decreasing contrast can be done with color and value, but also with stuff like line weight. So that's why this is maybe an interesting approach to kind of get that going. For the atmospheric perspective of a composition, there's a fairly easy way to kind of do that. You know, you just start with your sky, which is obviously very bright. And I'm not going to do like a full scene in this demo, but you can sort of just work your way forwards, decide, oh yeah, so my first mountains are going to be somewhat darker. Then I have my different layers that are going to be a little bit more dark. I'm going to be adding in like another one that's going to be perhaps a little bit more dark. Let's see, until we get like a good sense of depth in our composition. So once again, atmosphere being added in different ways. So depth, to kind of summarize everything we've discussed, we can add depth to a scene by playing around with perspective, by adding repeating elements in the different levels of depth, by adding overlap to our elements of our composition, and by playing around with the atmosphere. So next up, we actually can discuss a little bit about how we can create flow in a scene. So this scene in particular is actually a pretty good example. It's an older one, and I'm not too happy anymore with the end result, because at this point, obviously, I feel like I've improved a bit since this has been made like 2 years ago, I think. But it still showcases quite well how you can use a lot of, in this case, leading lines to show direction in a particular scene. Because the different creatures, like the different necks of the Hydra in this case, show us so many opportunities to actually redirect the eye in a particular direction so we end up in our focal point. So it's all about just adding in these elements and designing them in a particular way that they're acting as these arrows that are quite literally pointing in the direction of our focal point. Now, there's a bunch of different ways where we can actually apply this. This is obviously a quite literal way, but what we can do to just kind of simplify the idea of creating this composition, like imagine I have a cool, once again, since we're doing concept art right now, a cool guy with a stick, right? Cool guy with a stick is sort of the main way to go. And I want to make sure that this guy actually feels like a focal point. So I'm quickly going to duplicate him and move him to the side as well, so we can actually use him as an example twice. So the first version that I can make is I'll try to quite literally redirect the eye by perhaps designing the rocks around this character in a way where they're quite literally just very pointy shapes that are pointing in the directions of this character in particular. So I can add in like quite a few of these shapes, and once again they are basically creating arrows that are all pointing in the direction of my character. And this is a very easy way, and maybe a little bit too on the nose of a way, to actually create these sort of focus, these flows in our scene by using our arrows in our leading lines. And you can do that as well by adding in like a cloud that passes behind the character, and maybe the cloud gets more narrow, so we can actually once again create so many different levels of ways to kind of zoom into our focal point. Now, if this is too on the nose, I get it. This can definitely be a bit too loud, but there's an opportunity to do this in like more obvious situations when you're creating like very deliberate illustrations. But rather than maybe using literal lines that are passing through my character or pointing at my character, what if I now try to take a bit more of a subtle approach, and I still do like the different kinds of rocks, for example, but I'm designing them now instead of by pointing at them in a way where I'm arranging them in a very particular way to kind of get a similar end result. And I don't know if at this point you guys already sort of know what I'm doing, but it should become fairly clear in a second. So I can do the same thing again on the opposite side. So we'll add in like a few more perhaps. And then maybe like another one right there, and then another big one all the way over there, and maybe one more over there and one more over here. Now, the eye is still being drawn towards our character. It's not just a literal line pointing at our character anymore. Right now it's sort of become a connect the dots exercise where we can see these pillars have been arranged in a way that they still lead our eye all the way into our focal point, and we can create those lines any way we want, but just showing the different colors. I'll show you the amounts of times that we can actually try to like get through that situation where we are creating those quite literal connect the dots sort of situations. So I can do the same thing for these ones, the small ones that I've placed around over here. So they're also being used to kind of create that connect the dots situation where my focal point is actually quite clear. So there's no question that you're still being sucked into the center of the composition, just in a much less on the nose way, because now there's not literal lines, there is imaginative lines that the viewer will hopefully pick up on themselves. So that's for direction. Next thing that we can actually try to think about is going to be rhythm, and rhythm can be applied in two main ways. You either can consider the rhythm like we would the rhythm of anatomy, you know, whenever we think about the rhythm of something like, for example, an arm, we know, oh yeah, you have your deltoid that kind of goes into your biceps, that kind of goes into your lower arm, and that goes into your hand, and there's a rhythm to that limb that kind of interchanges direction every so often. So that's quite a fun way to kind of think about anatomy, but we can actually apply it in a very similar way to, you know, our larger scale environments. So what if I think about, for example, my environment? Again, we'll think perhaps mountain range or at least hills. So I can arrange these hills in a way where they're interlocking with each other to kind of redirect the eye every so often. And the redirection is quite important. So it's basically an arrow that's going in one direction that's being blocked by an arrow going the opposite direction. So that's the general idea. And we can redirect the eye and recreate that rhythm with all kinds of ways. So if I feel like my eye might be wandering off to the side of the composition, well, that just means I need to actually create a border there. And that might be like a tree or a house or a wall or anything else. And that kind of stops the eye right here and forces it to go back up the slope of the next hill. Perhaps here I'll add in my castle of some kind, or a tower or a building or a structure at least. And once again, I'll move there until I get stopped, and then I'll have to move back, and I can once again redirect the eye with another element into my composition. And I'm sort of creating a flow by continuously leading the eye somewhere and redirecting it by putting something on its path. So that's a very, very, very easy way to sort of get that going. And we can do that in a much less literal way once again by what if I have my character over here, and maybe this character has like quite a few sort of logs that have fallen over. Maybe it's actually weapons that are lying on the ground, and we can sort of come up with like a zigzag pattern that will eventually lead us there. Every so often we might still have the odd log that's just sort of off to the side, just to make it feel a little bit more organic and less forced in, because as long as that central pattern is obvious enough, like we can basically put in anything else in our composition that we want. And you can see, just as an abstract scene, it's once again leading the eye towards my focal point. Now, that's one way of thinking of rhythm, and that's the rhythm that has the flow quite heavily intertwined with it, because obviously this is just redirecting flow to create a rhythm. But rhythm can be done in a much more abstract way as well, but just by kind of thinking about the density of elements in your composition. So if I have a scene where I have all of these separate elements basically lined up, and I want to put more focus on one of these, what am I going to do? Well, I might actually want to squeeze another one in. And just because these are the only two that are so close together, that's immediately going to cause this rhythm to feel broken apart by something that basically doesn't belong in the pattern. And that just is a very good way to once again emphasize these two. And I can further emphasize that point by perhaps getting rid of some things around it. Now, what you can see in this scene in particular is, what if we now replace these sticks with actual, characters, and these characters are maybe actual, people that are sort of trying to, a little bit scared, maybe they're back to back, and they're trying to defend themselves with the weapons that they have, and they're being surrounded by all kinds of guys with, pikes and swords, and basically just a very structured army that's surrounded these people. And that's now once again creating that rhythm that creates a very clear sense of composition, a very clear focal point, because of the negative space I left in between these guys. So a fun way to explore composition. What we can also do is we can think of rhythm once again in that abstract way, but rather than what we have shown right here, and I'm just going to quickly move this to the side. What if we do the same thing, but now we sort of try to create a little bit of a gradient, and we start wide and we go more and more dense until we actually get to the point where we're reaching our peak, and then perhaps we can go more and more wide again, and wider and wider and wider. Translating this into, once again, some kind of composition where I have like a mountain range with a bunch of different mountains that are quite dense together in the center, and they're sort of fading out more and more. Not only fading out, but even getting like smaller and smaller perhaps is also a fun way to really further drive home that point. And by decreasing the density, we still have a very gradual rhythm, but it leads us to the climax of the scene, which is quite literally this height point that we have, the mountain at the center. So the density of our elements, very useful to play around with as well. Now, the variation I've sort of already discussed even within this purpose, because the reason these rhythms become interesting is because we can introduce variation in those rhythms. So the outlier in a pattern is the one that's going to stand out. So we want to create a pattern and break the pattern apart with something so that once again we bring focus to that specific pattern. So that's the three ways that I like to use to introduce flow into my composition. So the final thing that I want to discuss is how to create focus in a scene. And focus can be created in so many different ways, because the main thing that we can actually use to our advantage is going to be contrast. And contrast has literally an infinite amount of possibilities, because contrast is just the difference between one thing and another thing. So any two things that can be different can contrast each other. Because most people only think about contrast in value terms, but there are so many different options to actually introduce contrast in a scene. Now, in order to treat contrast and focus in an appropriate way, I'm gonna introduce you guys to something that you might already be familiar with, and that is the idea of the 80-20 rule. In my experience, a lot of people have at least know the name of this rule and interpret it in their own way, and I'm just going to do the same thing. I'm interpreting this in my own way and the way that I see fit to actually start applying this to a more complex composition. So what is the 80-20 rule? It's the idea that we are using ratios to our advantage to create something interesting. So whenever we have something that is a 50-50 split, so if I quite literally, for example, create a composition where I have a scene, and I just start out my scene by quite literally putting my horizon line down dead center in the scene, automatically I've created a less interesting scene because I've split my composition in half and I don't know whether the sky or the ground is going to be the area that's going to be most important. So I need to show off a hierarchy, and the hierarchy can only be visible by introducing variations. So by, for example, lowering the horizon line or heightening the horizon line, suddenly my scene immediately already starts becoming more interesting. And that is just the horizon line. So how can we actually introduce this or interpret this? We have our scene that should be able to stand on large shapes alone. Detail is still going to be important because that adds context to a composition. The large shapes is what we want to use to actually break down our composition into something that's nice and simple and graphic. Those 20%, once again, just serve a purpose of adding context to our scene and start adding detail to perhaps maybe bring even more attention to that focal point. We can also flip the ratio. We can start by a very complicated shape and actually leaving in negative space, but for now, just let's remember we want to have something that's probably mostly simple and has a little bit of complexity. The other thing that we can actually do is we need to think about this 80-20 rule less as something that's very specifically 80% versus 20%, more so anything that is enough of a difference so that it becomes noticeable. So why 50-50? Why not 50-50? Again, there's no real winner if you have a 50-50 split. 55-45, that's a little bit too close. 60-40, probably too close. But 70-30, that's about where I think things can be start becoming interesting. And obviously, if you want to go very extreme in scale, like I could do like a very large mountain with a very tiny person next to it, and that's still a good amount of contrast to create focus in a composition. Now, there are obviously other examples that we can use for using this 80-20 rule. So it can be 80% light, 20% dark, 80 soft, 20 sharp, 80 organic, 20 rigid, 80 blue, 20 orange, 80 warm, 20 cold, 80 desaturated, 20 saturated. Once again, anything that can have two elements that can oppose each other can be an option for how to use these 80-20. Some examples. This is an example that I made somewhere last year, and I wasn't a big fan of this scene. And at the time, I didn't really understand why. Now I have an idea of why that is. Like, I like the colors, I don't mind the composition, but it is quite literally just a scene that is split in half. And that is the reason that I don't find this appealing at the moment. Everything is sort of cut into two equal spaces, even 55% light and 45% dark. Like, there's slightly more brightness in there, but not enough to really make a big difference. So this is why the difference between these elements is less than ideal. While this scene, something that took me also not a large amount of time to create, but it does contain a very clear distribution of that 80-20 idea where I have something that is mostly dark and slightly light. And by containing that light around my focal point, suddenly my eyes automatically drawn into the scene. And all the other elements don't even matter, because this is just one big shape. But the fact that I have that amount of contrast in there immediately just gives this image such a boost that it will desperately need it. Another example of this, we have this scene in particular. And this one I think is an interesting example because value-wise, we might argue, well, that's actually pretty close to a 50-50 distribution. It's quite bright and quite dark at the same time. So why is this image still working? Well, because in this case, even though the values are fairly equal, if you look at the colors, you can immediately notice what I'm talking about. This is a mostly purple image with just a little bit of orange. And if we actually look at that distribution of color, well, it becomes very clear as to how that distribution is actually being made. So that's the idea of the 80-20 rule. It's a very, very fun way to sort of explore different ways to grab the viewer's attention at one specific point in our composition. And the most important thing to remember is by reserving some elements for the focal point alone. You don't have to spread everything around the entire scene. The orange light is only present around this focal point, and that is why that's the only thing that grabs attention. And immediately there's no doubt in my mind that most people will probably immediately look at this area of the composition. So that already explains the 80-20 rule. Now, why is this related to focus? Well, in other words, this is how we actually create focus and contrast in the composition. It's important to define what focus is, though, because focus actually, I think a lot of people tend to confuse how you can actually put focus on a specific scene. And this actually applies to a lot of things, like including things that we can think about in life. It's basically enhancing something at the cost of something else. And it's not leaving out the things that are unimportant. It is choosing between two important things and being brave enough to make that choice. So for example, in a scene, this composition in particular, it's actually quite important that there is these goblins that are, or trolls that are trying to hide from this patrol. That's pretty important part of the scene, but I had to choose which ones of these were more important. That's why the focus is so important. So the focus is on the guys searching for the goblins in this case. There's much less contrast around where the goblins are. Because these goblins, even though they are important, I had to choose where the viewer would have to look first. And that's why focus is being brave enough to choose between two important things. So these are a couple of simple principles that should help you at least get some idea on how to create more appealing compositions. If you want to know more about creating like more epic and adventurous scenes, like obviously there's still plenty of information on the Brushstyles website, so you can even find more information on creating compositions, on creating environments, etc. So please have a look there, because you'll immediately discover that there's so much more information to cover. But I'm going to show a couple of examples real quick on how you can apply this to your own little sketches. So let's have a look at how that can be done. The way that I usually like to have fun with trying to explore new compositions is actually by trying my hand at starting as wild and abstract as I can and basically doing a little bit of a cleanup phase after to get these compositions going. Why am I doing this? Because within the abstract colors alone, you can already see that I'm trying to get some focus in what I'm doing, because I start with like something that's, for example, mainly green, slightly pink, mainly orange, slightly blue, etc. And that gives me a good foundation to see where my painting actually is going. And I've predominantly tried to think about exactly that focus, making sure that I have a very clear area in my composition that's more important than the other. That's been created by the mountain peak. That's the only high thing in an entirely horizontal environment. The other mountain peak, that's the only thing that's in light in an entirely occluded environment. And that kind of compiles itself into so many different options in how you can actually create these appealing scenes. And the thing is here to actually just cut loose. These are usually my warm-up sketches, the way I kind of start my day. Each of these takes about 10 minutes to complete, maybe even less at times, depending on the subject. And I'm just trying to think about the main idea that I have mostly one color and slightly the other color. And I'm just kind of morphing the shapes into something that actually has meaning. For example, with all of these scenes that you can see right now, the scene itself is actually there quite quickly. Like in the first half of the entire process, the image is down. From that point on, it's just kind of redirecting a couple of shapes, making sure that I'm pointing things in the right direction and applying all the rules that we've discussed earlier very easily and very efficiently on these scenes. And you can take it very step by step. Now, you don't have to start with colors straight away. You can perfectly do this with value alone if color is a bit too daunting. Because with values, we can do the same thing, just balancing light and dark rather than warm versus cool. With the next example, once again, I start with a bit of a colorful background. And this was an older version. The one that you saw earlier was a very recent one. This one is probably about a year ago at this point. And this is when I first started out doing this particular exercise. Again, the main idea is to kind of keep as much of the underpainting in there, because that's the main setup of where my colors were actually going. So I'm trying to not do too much of a cleanup phase. I'm basically curating what information is still usable and what I still have to kind of redirect and repaint. And quite often for these, I actually don't have an idea on where I'm exactly going. I just kind of decide to explore while painting on what I can see within the colors that I've spotted down. So that kind of turns it into an exercise of recognizing patterns and intuitive design as well. Now, I would recommend you do this in any way you want, using any brush you want. Colors, values, doesn't matter to me, as long as you're consciously doing these sketches with some of these composition elements in mind. The fun thing is there's an infinite amount of options that you can come up with, and just let your brain roam free. Composition is a wonderful skill to have, because it will just allow you to create any scene that you would find appealing. So hopefully you guys found this lesson interesting and enjoyable. And once again, let me know what your suggestions are for future sessions.